Hi, everybody. Okay, up to this point, we've talked about evidence of evolution, why anybody would think evolution happens, right? We've come across fossils and similarities of species that suggest there used to be species that no longer exist, but are similar to the ones that exist today. That's a very different thing than trying to actually explain how the species change over time. That's a different matter altogether. We're going to turn our attention to that now. There have been a lot of different people that have put their attention to this, and I'm going to start by talking about one that got it dead wrong. His name was Lamarck, and he was a brave soul because he was willing to say, yes, species change over time. That was a difficult thing to say at the time. And he went about trying to explain how, and that's where he kind of went awry. So Lamarck had two ideas that went with this to explain how species could change over time. First, he said, the more that you use something, the stronger it gets, the more pronounced it gets. For example, if you're a runner, your legs get more muscly. If you lift weights, your arms get more muscly. The more you use those muscles, the more developed they get. The less you use them, the less developed they get. And he said that's, and we see that all the time. That's common sense. And that's part of this. If an individual organism uses some trait more than it had in the past, it'll become more developed with time. Now, his example of this brings home why this is a crazy idea. He said, there are organisms that are very similar to giraffes that exist today. And there are other species that are related to giraffes, but have very short necks. And he said, imagine that there were these animals once upon a time that were very similar to giraffes, but they had short necks, and all the food was up high. Well, they would reach really high to get that food, right? And as they stretched, their necks would get longer. Now, that seems a little crazy, but we know there's a tribe that exists in Africa who put the rings on their necks, right? And they do make their necks longer, right? So it is possible to stretch your neck. However, those folks who put those rings on their necks, they become dependent on them and can't hold up their heads anymore. And they don't get additional vertebrae or anything like that. The structures themselves are the same. They're just disconnected from each other to make the neck long. And so that really doesn't work for the giraffe necks. But it gets even crazier. He not only said that species get traits they want in their lifetime or that they need, they reach for them, they develop them. But not only that, they pass those traits to their offspring. That is, there is acquired characteristics. Acquire means to get. So the traits they get during their lifetime are passed to their offspring. Now, we know this is not the case, right? Let's say I get an injury and I get a scratch on my cheek, a scar that goes down my cheek, and then I have children. Will my children inherit the scar? No. This acquired characteristic, this trait that I got during my lifetime, it's changing the cells on my cheek. Is it changing my children's DNA, their genes? No. How do children inherit genes from me? Do they get my cheek cells? No. They get my egg cells, right? They get egg and sperm. So if the impact from life changes cells that are not sex cells, it's not going to be passed to the offspring. It has to happen in the sex cells to get passed to the offspring. So just because you get a trait during your life doesn't mean that you're going to pass it to your kids. Only if it impacts the genes in your sex cells will it pass to your kids. So Lamarck is essentially saying that because a species uses a particular part of their body, it will become more pronounced. And that as they do that, they will get these new traits that can then be passed to their offspring. And both of those steps are nuts. Now, I always like to tell the example of my life. So if Lamarck was right, I would be really lucky because I like to tell the story of my father. Now, my father had absolutely zero musical ability naturally. None. He had zero talent. But my father loved his older brother, and his older brother was killed in World War II. And when his older brother died, my father was distraught. He absolutely adored his older brother. And he decided, as a tribute to his older brother, he would learn to play piano because his older brother, Jack, played piano beautifully. So my father, who had absolutely zero musical talent, my mother used to say he was tone deaf, absolutely zero natural ability, learned to play the piano. He worked hard at it. He worked so hard at it as a tribute to Jack. And my father got really good. So good that he actually supported himself in New York City, in the Village, in the 50s, playing piano. So if Lamarck was right, what would that have meant for me? I would be born with the natural ability to play piano. I cannot play piano, and I have no natural ability in music at all. I inherited what my father inherited, no natural ability for whatever reasons, right? So Lamarck was wrong, and it makes sense that Lamarck is wrong. Think of all of your ancestors over millennia, how many times some ancestor lost a pinky or got a scar on their cheek or had a burn, and all of those traits would just keep passing on, accumulating. And what would you look like? You'd be a total wreck for all the stuff that's ever happened to your ancestors. And that's not the case, right? So we know that Lamarck is wrong. Now, that's not to say he didn't put the idea out there. He did. And science being what science is, there came along another scientist who said, not so much. Let's take a look at this. Let's test this, right? So this guy named Weismann decided he was going to run an experiment to see how if Lamarck was right, if traits that you get during your lifetime you could pass to your offspring. And he took mice and did something to them. If you think about for a moment what you might do to mice, a trait, what he did was kind of cruel. He cut off their tails. So he took a female mouse and a male mouse, and he cut off their tails and then had them mate. And he looked at the offspring. Now, if Lamarck was right, they would have no tails. The babies would have no tails. If Lamarck was wrong, the babies would have tails. So Weismann chopped off their tails and had them mate. And the babies had tails, because cutting off their tails doesn't change their sperm and egg. It just changes their tails. And so the male and female mouse would pass on their genes for the tails that they had in their eggs and their sperm. The offspring had tails. If Lamarck had been right, they wouldn't have. Now, some folks said, maybe it takes a few generations for it to stick. Like maybe you have to have that trait happen to the parent generation or the grandparent generation and the parent generation and the child and so on before it sticks. So Weismann, being the cruel dude that he was, took the children and cut their tails off and mated them. Maybe it would stick this time, right? Did the babies have tails? Sure they did, because it didn't change the sperm or the egg, right? And he did this for 22 generations. Cruel. And every generation, no matter how long you do this, will have tails. And that means that Lamarck is just wrong. Now, why did I share this with you if he was just wrong? Because the truth is that most of us talk about evolution like Lamarck. We say things like giraffes, the leaves were up high, so they adapted to have long necks. That sounds like Lamarck. But that's crazy. That does not happen. And so we have to give evolution a good deal more thought before we can say that we think this is an actual thing that can happen, because we know that traits that you acquire during a lifetime cannot be passed to offspring. Just imagine if you had a snake that lives in in the rainforest at the equator, and you pluck that thing out of the rainforest and dropped it at the North Pole, would it grow a fur coat because it needs it? Heck no, it would freeze to death. And so we can't just talk about species needing traits and therefore getting them. So next time, I'm going to talk about our current understanding of how species can change over time to replace Lamarck's very misguided ideas. But Lamarck's very misguided ideas are ones we often hold ourselves. So it's really important to remember that you do not just get traits because you need them, and you do not pass on traits just because you got them during your lifetime.